I'm Michael Dews. I teach in the Department of Communication at the University of Arizona. And I've been studying conflict and working with it professionally for about 35 years. As a teacher and a scholar at the university, I study it, I teach a course in it. I also spent a little over a decade as a full-time management consultant working with organizations mostly dealing with their conflict issues. So I come at it from those two angles, both as a scholar and as a professional. And of course, I've been living for a long time, so all of us deal with conflict over time. Everybody encounters conflict, and we learn lessons about managing it as we go along. You know, scholars and professionals have been studying the management of conflict very intensely since about the mid-20th century, and they're still working at it. And what they've generated is some new thoughts, some new understanding, and they've really based that on some good, credible research. So we've got stuff to build on as we think about how we might handle conflict better. What we can do through this course is help you understand what's going on in a conflict better, help you understand the elements that are involved with it that you may be managing and trying to juggle as you deal with the conflict, and also giving you very specific things that you can do to get better results managing it. I do want to suggest that managing conflict is not it's not the kind of thing that we can just give you an easy recipe. This is not a gee whiz course. This is not, here's 5 quick ideas that I can use, and if I follow this formula, I'll always get a good result. No, conflict is really a fine art. It's among the most challenging and difficult things that humans do, and it involves a lot of subtleties, and every single situation is different. So we can get better at it. We can understand it better. And each of us has to do it within our own personality in an authentic way as being who we are. But we're not going to give you simple recipes in this course. We are going to give you insights, and we're going to give you lots of suggestions of things you can do, and we'll give you some specific processes that you can follow as kind of outlines that will tend to get better results as we go through. In the end, I think you'll understand better, and I think if you go with us through this course, that you'll be able to handle your conflicts better. One other thing about this course that I want to tell you up right in front here is that it's not just a lecture course. When we're talking about conflict and ways not to handle it and ways to handle it, we have to think about how people would do and talk in conflict situations. So it really helps here to add some dramatizations to use as examples to show you what conflicts look like in practice that you can test your own self against. Familiar scenes, common things that happen in conflicts, things not to do, things to do. We can show you tools and illustrate them with dramatizations so that you can have tools and techniques for ways to talk about it in language for handling conflict better. So that's what we're going to be doing in this course. Let's begin here with some definitions and getting ourselves clear on what a conflict really is. Best way to begin actually is not with the definition itself, but with some of those examples which we can do as dramatizations. Let's start with one here. Let's think about a person named Rebecca who's in graduate school, and she's studying in her room. She has a roommate in an apartment that she's staying in this graduate school, and Jane is a working person. Jane's had friends over. They've been watching TV with her while Rebecca's been studying in her room.
Pizza's on me next week. See you guys.
Hey, Jane, I'm trying to study for a test tomorrow. I can't even hear myself think.
I'm sorry, I thought you had classes on Wednesdays. I didn't even know you were here. Why didn't you say anything?
I shouldn't have to say anything. How many times do I have to tell you I have class on Tuesday and Thursday nights? Maybe you're just gonna have to check with me before you bring anybody over.
Are you my mother now?
Classic example. Two good people. Jane and Rebecca are probably friends. They see this thing differently. Jane has her interests and needs. Rebecca has hers. There's a clash about this. Two good people. Ordinary, everyday, classic, common conflict. All right. Let's look at another example. Let's go to a married couple for this one. We'll call them Ken and Kate. Ken's thinking he'd like to take a job in another city, perhaps out west. How does that conflict develop?
Honey, Take a look at this.
Sounds like a great job, but it's in Denver.
Yeah, but you know how much I want to get out west. And I think it's the perfect next step for me. I've already applied for it.
You have to be kidding. You didn't even ask me about this before applying? I can't leave Chicago right now. I have a real career here. Why should I go somewhere else and start over? Go to Denver, if that's what you want, but it won't be with me.
Ken and Kate love each other. They're married to each other. He's got a longing to get somewhere else that's emerging through this thing, and she's got a career here that she's very tied to and stressed about at times, and it's not something she's ready to give up. That's a very classic conflict, and in these days of two career couples, that's not the least bit uncommon. So that's a second example of a conflict. Now let's go to a third. Where can we go for a third? Let's go to work. Don is a salesman. He doesn't like the boundaries of his sales territory. He's driving too long in one direction, spending too much time in the car. He's a little unhappy about that. So he's got a conflict with his manager who assigned him this territory. So he's going to talk to his manager.
I'm sure we can rework those numbers and get those to you by close of business. Promise. All right, yeah, no problem. Thanks.
Hey, Dale, look, we need to talk about the new territory you assigned me. It's just not working for me.
What's the problem?
You got me driving all over the place. I'm spending all my time in the car and not enough time with my customers. I mean, Pat's got way less driving and more potential customers. It's just not fair.
Look, Don, there are good reasons for the decisions I make. The last thing I need is you questioning whether I'm fair or not.
Dale's feeling a little unpleasantly challenged here, isn't he? He knows he can't please everybody. And he's feeling challenged because he knows that Don has a bit of a reasonable complaint, but Don's kind of gone over the top challenging him. That's not a terribly uncommon conflict that could happen at work in a variety of situations. So if you think about these examples, think about them in your own life. Do these look, or things like this, look familiar to you? They certainly do to me, and they certainly do to many of my students. They're just common conflicts that occur. And if we can recognize those as conflicts, now the definition, when we lay out a specific definition, will make pretty clear sense to us. Let's do two definitions. We'll do the long version and the short version. For the long version, let's go and look at Wilmot and Hawker's definition. William Wilmot and Joyce Hawker do a textbook called Interpersonal Conflict, and I've used that textbook for years and years and years. So I rely on them a lot, and I always rely on this definition of theirs for a conflict. But it's the long form. They say a conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goals. It's a long definition. We'll unpack it here in just a few seconds. Let's get a shorter definition first. The short definition is my own, and the only thing I'm proud of about it is it's so nicely short. I can reduce it to two words. It's a discomforting difference. We can say that a conflict is a discomforting difference. That is a difference that bothers one party or the other. For the person it bothers, that conflict, that difference constitutes a conflict. Mine is easier for in the moment, in the heat of the situation. Theirs is better for doing the research that we need to do to understand fully what's in a conflict. The Wilmot and Hawker definition is very good about having most of the elements that are always present in mind. They're just sort of clearly implied. So let's add a little description here. Let's talk about the 5 elements that are always present when there's a conflict, no matter what definition we use. First element was there and it was present. It was present in the definition in the words that Wilmot and Hawker used. They called the parties interdependent. The parties in a conflict need to be interdependent or there will not be a conflict. Interdependence is factor number 1. By interdependent, what we mean is that the behavior of one has an effect on the other. Rebecca and Jane are interdependent with one another. How they behave in that apartment, how each behaves affects the other. How the territories are assigned affects Don. Whether Ken applies for a job out west and takes a job certainly affects Kate, and whether she refuses to go affects him. All these parties are interdependent. You don't have conflicts with people that you're not interdependent with. Second one, difference. There's got to be a difference, at least in Wilmot and Hawker's terms, a perceived difference that really is going to bother somebody. So that element's always there. There's some difference that the parties are going to be unhappy over. At least one of them will be unhappy. Third element, there will always be some sense of opposition. Wilmot and Hawker, in their definition, phrased it as frustration of the goals. The other person seems to be impeding them. Other writers describe it in a slightly different way, but it's always some sense of opposition that's present, that one party at least has when that party's feeling a conflict. There's a fourth element here. The thing has to be expressed. At least the researchers are very careful about this. We don't mean to be talking about, and this course is not about, just the internal conflicts that I feel I'm drawn this way and that, and so I'm having trouble making up my mind. It's conflicts between people, and we can't see that conflict. We can't look at it, we can't deal with it between people until it gets expressed in some fashion. Somebody's got to act in a way. Some psychologists call it a behavioral manifestation. I'm in the communication field, so I like the term, it needs to be expressed. Expression is the fourth of those five basic elements. There's a fifth basic element, and that's emotion. There's always some level of feeling, and it's a negative emotion that's involved whenever there's a conflict. It's most typically some level of anger. It may be extreme, it may be not, but there's always some level of emotion involved, negative emotion. And that's one of the things we'll have to deal with, and one of the things that makes it hard to deal with conflict and manage it. Two other terms I want to define for you really quickly here as we get started. We use the term conflict resolution a lot, and we also use the term conflict management. It was kind of interesting in the first years that I was studying this subject, all the way through the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, the 1980s, researchers talked about studying conflict resolution, and we titled our courses Conflict Resolution. We don't call it resolution so much anymore. We're more happy with the term conflict management because there's a difference in what these mean. If it's conflict resolution, it means we resolve the conflict. But the truth is that many, many conflicts are never going to be resolved, and they're still going to have to be managed. So the term conflict management is a broader term. It refers to the whole business of what we do to deal with the conflict. Ideally, we resolve it. That is a mainstream part of it, but it's not the whole story of conflict management. Why do we need to handle conflict better than we do? There's sort of two ways to look at this. One is how to avoid the harms and reduce them, and the other is how to reach the good things that can come from it. When I talk about avoiding the harms, I like to talk about what I call the 4 awful truths about conflict. The 4 awful truths go this way. Number 1, conflict will occur. Conflict is inherent in human interaction. We're all alike in many ways, but we're all different in ways. We have different perceptions. We have a lot of common needs, but we also have different needs. Our timing is different. If we're interacting with somebody else over time, there's bound to be some conflict. So conflict is going to occur. Second awful truth. Whenever it occurs, conflict always involves some risks and some costs. Consider those examples that we ran there. Jane and Rebecca can end up being hostile to each other and have a hostile living situation, or one might have to move out and have her life disrupted. Costs and risks. Don going to the boss could get in trouble. Ken and Kate could split up over this. I mean, there's risk involved, and there's cost, there's pain and struggle thinking it through, and time and energy taken. So there's always cost, and there's always some risk whenever a conflict comes up. Third major awful truth about conflict is that the damage that happens when there are costs, when there's damage done, the damage that happens results not so much from the conflict itself, the difference itself, but from what I call the dysfunctional strategies that we use to try to deal with it. And by dysfunctional, what I mean is it may get us a result that we wanted, but it will also get us a side effect that we didn't want. Dysfunctional strategies do most of the harm when we're involved in a conflict, not the conflict itself. And the fourth awful truth is that some of that damage, some of it is irreversible. Consider the examples again. Kate said, if you move out there, you're going out there alone. And Ken might think, boy, she values this career more than I, and that could hurt him for a long time. Some of that damage might be irreversible. It often is. So we have to be careful in a conflict situation. Conflict's going to happen. It's going to do damage. We surely have reason to handle it as well as we can in order to minimize the damage that we do. But I want you to note that there's another reason here. There's the positive side. Conflict is also very, very useful. Conflict surfaces problems that we didn't see before. That's especially useful in organizations coming across problems when they arise, because conflict triggers our ability to recognize them. Going through conflict deepens our understanding of one another and enables us to improve our relationships and actually get them to a much deeper, more honest level than they were before. There are actually wonderful breakthroughs in honesty and closeness in relationships that happen as a result of working through a conflict well. So conflict may be painful, it's risky, it can do damage, but it can also be our friend in relationships, including work relationships, because it can also do us a lot of good. So what we're looking for in terms of handling conflict better, being successful at it, is what we want to do is minimize any damage, even if we can't eliminate it, and lower the costs, and we want to gain the gains that can come from it as best we can. Handling it better would mean some of both of those things. I want to call it a success story, the management of conflict, and I mean that in a couple of different ways. One is, we can have more successes with managing conflict if we do that. And the other is, we've had a lot of success in understanding it better. Let me just preview some examples. Later in the course, we'll talk about examples of some successes in resolving major conflicts. And those three that we'll talk about later are, one will be the Camp David Accords reached in 1978 that led to the 1979 peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. That was negotiated by Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin with the help of President Carter in the United States. That treaty has never been broken between Israel and Egypt, the only successful negotiation that we really know of in the Middle East. A marvelous success story. A second great success story was the START 1 treaty that we later had START 2, and we've recently extended that. But negotiating that first START 1 treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, in which they agreed to limit and reduce the number of nuclear weapons and missiles that they had and means of delivering weapons, was a marvelous advance in the safety of the world. And this was at the end of a Cold War, or still in the middle of a Cold War, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the third one that I want to talk about is a solution that came between two governors in the United States of two different states, one of whom was very recognized as a liberal environmentalist, and the other was very recognized as a staunch conservative. And the two of them sat down and worked out a set of principles for managing issues and conflicts when they come up, for handling issues of environment. So that was a marvelous success story. We'll tell those. So there are successes, and you probably have some in your own life. There are successes with the handling of conflict, even the big, seemingly intractable conflicts. But there's another way in which we have success with handling conflict, and that's doing the research. I said since the mid-20th century there's been plenty of research. Scholars and practitioners have really worked at this. How can we get better? It's a major area of research in psychology, in sociology, in communication, and in organizational management. All scholars looking in all those areas trying to find better ways. Here's some of the questions that they've gotten better answers to. Here's one. In order for me to win in a conflict, does the other party have to lose? Or do we have to compromise in order to keep somebody from losing? Well, it turns out, and we'll talk about this in Lecture 3, that most of the time, no, we don't have to compromise, and no, nobody has to lose. We can actually both win. That's where the term win-win comes from, and we'll describe that in Lecture 3. Here's another question. What are we really after when we engage in conflict? And how do we understand that? Why is it in connection with that we sometimes get what we think we've fought for, but we do damage to the relationship in the process so that our victory turns out to be a net loss? Well, we have a lot better understanding of our multiple and complex goals in conflicts now, and we'll talk about that in Lecture 6. Good scholars have produced good answers that help us with that. Here's another question. If we want to reach a good resolution in terms of all of the goals that we might have, what should we focus on in negotiating? How should we go about that? How should we proceed? We begin to deal with that in Lecture 10. We have some very good answers to that kind of a question. So we've got successes. We've got examples of success. We've got successes in our own lives, large scale, small scale. We've got good research that's successful in getting us better answers. So we have some. We can learn new and better ways to handle conflict. But I want us to stop and be careful here a little bit, because it's not as easy as just, oh yeah, let's do it differently now and we'll do it better. Because we're not writing on a blank slate when we try to change the way we think about or understand or behave in a conflict. The fact is, we started learning to manage conflict early, and those lessons are not just going to go away because we've researched this or listened to a lecture or done some reading. We've been learning to deal with conflict from our culture, we learn in our organizations, and certainly we learn in our families starting very early in our lives. Just think of some examples of that just briefly here. There's a difference in how cultures approach conflict. One obvious one that gets cited very often is the difference between Asian cultures and Western cultures in these terms. And what the Asian cultures do is they're much more concerned with the overall context, with protecting one another's face, and they can be very slow to deal with things, and they're not very direct in coming at you with a conflict. You're supposed to understand the context. In Western cultures, and especially in the United States and in Australia, and to somewhat lesser extent in Canada, we tend to be much more about getting in your face. We want to talk about it right away, and we want to get this resolved. And those are cultures that formed with people who migrated from somewhere else. They were getting started in a new land. They were transient. They were newly getting together, and they need to get this resolved now. So you can see why the cultures would be different. But the cultures teach us things about how to handle conflict. Get to a somewhat more specific level, all of our organizations that we belong in and we live so much of our lives in, organizations are like families too. All of us who work live much of our lives there. Each organization develops cultures about how to handle conflict, and so do professions. An example that comes to mind for me with that is kind of my own university settings where you have faculty. When faculty get into conflict, we tend to be fairly dysfunctional about that. We're all trained and enculturated to be individual thinkers, to make our case, to put our stance out there. So we tend to argue, and we're not very good at thinking in terms of what the other person sees. We want to argue everything out. It's just what faculty do. Another example would be the kind of organization where you got to be tougher than we are, and there are some where people say things like around here, look, we don't get mad, we just get even. There are organizations where that's the culture and that's the way they think. Deeper than all of that, deeper than that is the family structure. We all learned early in life about conflict and how to handle conflict and what it means and what happens if we handle it in a given way. We learned it in our families starting when we were very young, as toddlers. That age that parents tend to call the terrible twos. There was that first moment when you, as a little toddler, tried out saying no for yourself. You'd heard your mom and dad say it, and at one point you looked up and tried it, and you looked up at one of those people and you said, no! And how that person reacted was probably your first lesson in managing conflict. And you've been learning it ever since. So we learned in the family. And what we did learn, the lessons we learned, led to behaviors that we adopted and we got habitual at and we got skilled at. So our early learning drives an awful lot of the way we deal with conflict. Then we go choose organizations where we can apply those skills. It all fits within the culture. So we're not people who come to conflict like it's a new subject. We're people who come to the subject of conflict management having learned it early. We've got built-in ideas. Some of that learning really works well. I mean, we're getting along, we're not killing each other. It still amazes me that humans do as well as we do with managing conflict, although we could do a lot better. But some of the ideas we got and some of the ways we're dealing with conflict turned out to be wrong ideas. Let's just think briefly of some examples of wrong ideas for handling conflict. Here's one. Pretty common. Conflict should not be occurring. We're not supposed to have conflict with each other. If we're a good team and we work together, or we're a couple and we love each other or whatever, we shouldn't be having a conflict. It's not supposed to happen. That's wrong. The truth is that conflict will occur in every one of those situations. Conflict's going to occur with people we're interdependent with. So it's going to happen. Here's another wrong idea. When conflict does occur, the person I'm having a conflict with is my enemy. Wrong. We know now that that's just not the case. Conflict occurs most commonly among couples, among family members, among friends, among work colleagues, the people we happen to be interdependent with. And they're very likely to be the most people we should least want to think of as our enemies, and people we think we shouldn't be having conflict with. Here's another wrong idea about conflict. Some people think that winning requires having more power than the other party. That one especially comes up in work settings. Supervisors would often say to me, well, I can't deal with him. I don't have the power to fire him. Now, you don't need that kind of power over somebody. The only power we need in a conflict to have good odds at getting a resolution is enough interdependence from the other party, enough influence on outcomes for the other party so that it's sort of worth their while to take the time to work the thing out with us. That doesn't have to be more power or even equal power with them. One more wrong idea. This one I hate the most. It's the one that says if we could just communicate better, we could resolve all our conflicts. Conflicts are just communication problems. Wrong. It's not true. Communication is essential to resolving conflicts almost always, but it's rarely a solution in itself. Just communicating better might just make it clearer that we had more difference than we thought that we had. So that's a wrong idea. Communication we need, but it's not a solution to every conflict, and it wouldn't avoid the conflicts that are going to occur. So those are wrong ideas, and those wrong ideas get built into the language we use to talk about conflict, the metaphors with which we think about conflict. If we use a metaphor like battle, we had a clash over that. If we're thinking in that way about conflict and using that language, it's driving us in a direction that's going to make it harder for us to actually resolve the conflicts that we have. So we're burdened with some wrong ideas along with the good lessons we learned for handling conflict, and we'll try to get that better in this course. Okay, what have we learned then? Just here in lecture 1, we've got a definition of conflict. The short one is that conflict is a discomforting difference. It's a difference that bothers one party or the other. We learned that there are key elements that are in that conflict, in every conflict. Interdependence of the conflicting parties with one another. A sense of opposition between the parties. Some kind of expression of the conflict has to take place. There are negative emotions always present in the conflict. Those factors are always present. We learned how to deal with conflict early in life, and that gets reinforced in our organizations and throughout our whole culture, so we're not writing on a blank slate. Still, we can learn to think about conflict differently. We can understand it and ourselves in a conflict better, and we can learn better ways to manage it. So let me give you an assignment before we get to lecture 2. Here's what I'd like to ask you to do, and I'm going to give you an assignment at the end of each lecture and ask you to try it because I think it'll help build in the learning. Here's the one for lecture 1. Try to identify where, when, and how you learned what you think of as your most compelling lesson about conflict. It's probably an early lesson, the most compelling early lesson you learned for how to deal with conflict. And then try to describe for yourself what that lesson is and what it leads you to do typically when you're handling conflict. That's part 1 of the assignment. Then I'd like you to do this. I'd like you to dream up some examples of conflict in your own life that you're familiar with, that you can sort of test what we say throughout the course against. Think of 2 or 3 examples of conflict in your own experience that you're familiar with, so that as we go along and give insights and suggest ways of handling, you can test those and think through how that might have worked in those conflicts. That's your assignment. Where do we go from here? I've given you the idea in this lecture that we've only been talking about since the mid-20th century and what we know about conflict. But we're actually going to need to start earlier than that. So here's what's going to happen. If we skip to lectures 3 through 14, what we're going to do is look at the nature of conflict, the roles that we have in it, perspectives in conflict, the emotions, the goals, and we'll look at ways to handle conflict in general better. Then we'll do several lectures, 15 through 18, in which we'll talk about the most important relational contexts in which we have conflict, our close personal relationships and our organizational work relationships, and talk about conflict in those particular situations. And finally, we'll do several lectures where we talk about things like where to get help, how to manage the aftermath after dealing with the conflict's over, how to teach our children about conflict, management, where we go from here in the future. And that'll pull the course together. But you notice I started that with lecture 3 through 14. That's that problem of the mid-20th century. Before we can come to our modern times and research on conflict, we have to go back and we have to think about the most important single discovery in the management of conflict in human history, arguably the most important discovery that was made. And that was a discovery made by the ancient Greeks about 2,500 years ago, and it's called the adversary system. That's what we'll do in lecture 2.